on a personal note, what does it mean to decolonize yourself intellectually, and what was your personal journey like doing that?
Well, I think the disadvantage that young Singaporeans like you have is that your minds were never colonized. Whereas the advantage we had in my generation is that our minds were colonized. And certainly when I was born in Singapore in 1948, my birth certificate said I was a British subject. And I grew up believing, since I was living in a British colony in the first 11 years of my life, that I was led to believe that the British people or the white people were naturally superior to the Asian people. And that whether we like it or not, our place in life was to be deferential to the Europeans or the British. And so, having experienced that myself, the sense of inferiority, I know how powerful and pernicious such mental colonization can be. But at the same time, of course, being liberated from it is also a wonderful experience when you grow up to realize, hey, actually we Asians are as good as any Westerner, any European, any British. And indeed, nowadays, if you look at the performance of Asians in the leading American universities, it's clear that Asian students are now outperforming students from the West, clearly. And indeed, if, let's say, for example, the leading Ivy League universities like Harvard or Yale or Columbia or Princeton did a race-blind admission, okay? Didn't look at the race, just look at the exam results and performance. They might end up in universities where half the population is Chinese, half is Indian. And there might be no Westerners in that. So
we are sorry to interrupt you, but before we move on to the next point, we noticed that a lot of you are returning viewers who have not subscribed. If you've enjoyed our content, subscribing would mean the world to us. It's a small click for you, but it makes a huge difference for us. Thank you for your support.
So it's amazing, in one lifetime, I lived through a period where Asians were seen to be inferior, then Asians were seen to be equal, and now quite often they're perceived to be superior, certainly in areas like academic performance and so on and so forth.
When was that moment for you when you realized that you were on par with some of the Western peers that you had, maybe in school or when you entered foreign service?
I don't think there was a single moment, but there was a sort of a gradual process. Certainly, I would say my education in philosophy and gave me a lot of cultural confidence, because if you found that you could argue with the West on Western terms and end up sometimes winning the arguments, then that's the first step towards, in a sense, intellectual liberation. But it was a gradual process. But certainly working with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam, who were very confident about themselves and about their ability to do things. So to some extent, I sort of inherited some of their cultural confidence just by working with them.
You worked with the three of them relatively intimately, or at least you managed to build strong relationships with them. There was Lee Kuan Yew, I think that was the man that everyone knew. Then you also had a very special relationship with Dr. Goh. And even in your formative years in foreign service, you also worked under S. Rajaratnam, where you saw him stand up in the Non-Aligned Summit. You saw him become the Singapore Lion. I would like to ask you to maybe share a little bit more about your relationship with each of these men and how they have shaped you.
Well, I must emphasize that all three of them were my bosses. But they were the best bosses to have. They were demanding, but at the same time, they educated you a lot, So in the case of, clearly Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was the most formidable, the most intimidating person of all three of them. And so you always felt that you had to perform well when you were with him. But at the same time, while Mr. Lee Kuan Yew could be very fierce and intimidating, especially in public settings, in private settings, I described the lunches that Ambassador Tomiko, Ambassador Chan Eng-chi and I had with him regularly over a few years in the mid-1990s. When you meet him in private, he's a very good listener. He's very keen to learn about what's happening in the world. He's very curious. So in that sense, also, if you say something that is interesting and relevant, he appreciates it very much. But Dr. Goh was also in his own way quite intimidating. But I developed more of a personal relationship with him because I was a friend of his son, Goh Kian Chi, and Goh Kian Chi's wife, Tan Seok San, whom you just interviewed. And so I would meet them in family settings, in their houses, and so I got to know Dr. Goh in a much more relaxed way. And he became much more relaxed after he stepped down from political office in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And certainly at lunches and dinners, he would open up to me and I describe some of the things he said. And of course, Rajaratnam is the person with whom I spend the most time physically, because he was my boss in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I would travel with him. When I was in KL, he would come and visit Kuala Lumpur because he had relatives in Seremban. Then I would sit in the car with him on the long car rides to Seremban and talk to him. And then when I was ambassador to the UN, he would come every year for the UN General Assembly, spend a week to 10 days in the UN. So I spent a lot of time with him. And he's by far the most relaxed, the most calm, charming person you can be with. This. And he didn't believe in trying to intimidate you in the way that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew could or would.
And you spoke about him being the Singaporean lion and him standing up at the non-aligned movement back when Vietnam invaded Cambodia. You were there in person. What was the experience like? Could you share a little bit more about how you saw Mr. Rajaratnam represent Singapore, such a small state in the global fora? How did he champion not just Singapore interests but multilateral interests in this?
Well, when we were in Cuba in 1979, Singapore was in some ways outgunned and outnumbered because Fidel Castro, the leader of Cuba, was very close to the Soviet Union, and he invited a lot of leaders who were pro-Soviet Union, and therefore they supported the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, because Vietnam was also tied to the Soviet Union. And so after Vietnam invaded Cambodia, the previous government should have kept its seat. The Pol Pot government, communist government, should have kept its seat in the non-aligned movement, but Castro wanted to get rid of them. And so he tried to organize a big meeting, and at the big meeting, many countries said, no, this cannot be done. So he organized a special small group meeting where he invited primarily leaders who were closely tied to the Soviet Union to try and intimidate Singapore and Sri Lanka, the only two non-Soviet allied states in the room. And the Sri Lankans were clearly intimidated and didn't say a word. But Mr. Rajaratnam, even though he was only a foreign minister and he had to debate heads of government, presidents and prime ministers, he wasn't the least bit intimidated, not in the least bit. So I was really impressed by his courage, because courage is always contextual. You can be very brave when there's no threat to you, but when you have to deal with people, very formidable personalities who try to intimidate you, many people would have melted in that situation, but Rajaratnam did not melt at all. So I think in that sense I was amazed what a fierce guy he could be in a fight, and I could understand how he was such a strong companion of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew when he fought the communists.
The reason why I asked about that was because I think that was one of the big wars maybe in the past 60 years that maybe Southeast Asia's experienced. And now we live in a world where we're experiencing two wars. And to understand what can play out in the coming decades, it will be useful to refer back to the past. I think that was where my interest was piqued. And in your book, The ASEAN Miracle, you talk about Southeast Asia being this miracle of peace, which is why I wanted to understand, how do we get here? It's like the fish in water analogy that David Foster Wallace talks about, which is that the fish that lives in water does not know that it's in water. Peace is a non-event, as you said. So when you're living in peace, you're not surprised. So I would like to maybe focus our attention on the wars that are happening now. The two main wars now we see in the world. The first one is the war in Gaza. It's weird because we have a special relationship with Israel, but at the same time, we see, I liken it as what's happening in Gaza is to like the millennials Vietnam War. We're being exposed to very graphic imagery across the world through social media on how the war is playing out. So then my question would be then, what do you think are the obstacles to peace? Is there a way out for this?
Well, you're right, there are two ongoing wars now, the Gaza war and the Ukraine war. But I've been studying geopolitics for over 50 years now, and the big lesson I've learned is that wars are avoidable. But of course, wars are avoidable if you have wise and strong leaders who can make the right decisions to prevent wars. But quite often, and this is the tragedy about the West. In the past, it was the Western countries that had wise and strong leaders. Now, many Western countries have weak and ineffective leaders. So, for example, the Gaza war could have been avoided if, for example, the United States, which always says that it's in favor of a two-state solution, had worked harder to achieve a two-state solution. So that means that Palestinians would have had a state also. Maybe a somewhat demilitarized state because Israel is very concerned about security, reasonably so. But something could have been done. But unfortunately, you haven't had any American leaders strong enough. Only the United States is big enough, strong enough to persuade the parties, Israel and Palestine, to come together. But they failed to do so. And because they failed to do so, the wound continued to fester. And then when the wound continues to fester, you get an outbreak. That's what happens. And certainly we should condemn the Hamas for its killing of innocent Israeli civilians. That's completely unjustifiable and should be condemned, But at the same time, you also have to ask yourself, could all this have been avoided if a bigger effort had maybe made to create a two-state solution? Similarly, in the Ukraine war, I also believe the Ukraine war could have been avoided. And here, surprisingly, the United States and the West had two eminent American statesmen who warned against the expansion of NATO, towards Ukraine. One was George Kennan, the man who actually was responsible for America's successful strategy in the Cold War, the containment policy. He advised strongly against NATO because he said this would alarm the Russians and trigger a negative reaction. There's a famous interview he gave to Tom Friedman, which I think everyone should read. And then also Henry Kissinger wrote an article in 2014, 10 years ago, in Washington Post, suggesting a compromise formula for Ukraine, whereby Ukraine would keep its independence and sovereignty, Ukraine could join the European Union, but Ukraine will agree not to join NATO, right? I mean, these are all sensible compromise proposals that were put forward, but unfortunately, there were no strong Western leaders who were capable of carrying out this advice, And indeed, in my last conversation with Henry Kissinger one-on-one in October 2022, about a year before he died, he clearly indicated to me in a very subtle way that the quality of mind of many Western leaders today is not what it used to be. And they don't have the capacity to do strategic long-range thinking in the way that the Churchills and Eisenhowers and all could do in the past. And I think that the deterioration in the quality of Western leadership is also one of the explanations for the continuation of wars in Gaza and Ukraine.
What do you guys think? Do you think he is right when he said wars are caused by weak leader? Please leave your comment below. We would love to hear from you.
Thank you for making it this far. If you like this video, you might want to share it with a like-minded friend. Thank you, and as always, stay blessed.